the doctrine of creation has been accosted by two questions, the question of when and how. And in so doing, we have forgotten more fundamental aspects of the doctrine of creation that are central to the Christian tradition in all places and in all times. So, if we want to move in a direction of understanding the Christian response to creation, or the Christian doctrine of creation in terms of the great tradition, then we have to move away from some of these questions of when and how, and we have to move towards different questions that will focus us once again on the doctrine of creation for the great tradition. And so, even though at the end of our time together here we will say a few words about some of those debates, the bulk of Olson's material really doesn't address those issues at all. Instead, he begins with the simple notion, and the same way he's done throughout the book so far, the same way he will do throughout the rest of the book, he starts with a dialectical tension. He essentially says that creation is both good and fallen, and we have to deal with that tension theologically in order to understand what is fully going on. And in all reality, the doctrine of creation is one that that sits at the center of a lot of theological debate, and depending on where you fall down on this spectrum of whether creation is good or creation is fallen, will determine how you respond theologically, and even more to the point, it'll determine how you respond pastorally in certain situations. Let's take, for instance, very quickly, the idea of women in ministry. At first you think, well, that makes no sense at all, why women in ministry would come up in the doctrine of creation. But ultimately it does come up in the doctrine of creation, because if you will assert that it was God's good plan from the foundation of the world to have a hierarchy or some sort of hierarchical relationship amongst men and women, then you will assert that in one way or another it is improper for women to be ministers. However, if you look back at the Genesis account and you determine that the hierarchical relationship that was established and spoken of in Genesis chapter 3 was as a result of the curse, then you would assert similarly that that the hierarchical relationships that we see around are not part of God's good plan, but they are a part of the fallen world, and that as a part of God's grace and mercy, we can in some way overturn that that hierarchical posture. So this is how central the doctrine of creation can be to so many aspects of pastoral ministry and practice, and it's not just some sort of kind of out there perspective. Now, we're going to get into more detail as we go, but I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward, that depending on whether you find the curse on nature becoming most prominent or the original blessing of God's presence most prominent, will determine how you fall on certain issues, whether it's women in ministry, issues of ecology, or whatever it may be that you face off with. The two central principles that he closes his opening section with and that helps him move into a Christian consensus on creation is this: that creation is good, but it's not God, and that it is good, but that it is fallen under a curse. So you can see how in this way he is dealing with the tension between blessing and cursing. It is a good thing, it's a great thing, but it's not to be equated with God, and it is good insofar as God created it, but ultimately we know that it's under a curse and it's fallen, and that has to go through a process of redemption. Which leads us to the four things that he will propose as the central items of Christian consensus about creation. He pulls these from Langdon Gilkey in a book that Langdon wrote called Maker of Heaven and Earth, and it's a book on the doctrine of creation at large, but he takes three of these directly from Langdon, and then he adds one of his own that is, of course, important to the overall doctrine of creation, but is also important to the concept of redemption that we'll get to later. Those four items are simply this: God is the source of all that there is, number one. Creatures are dependent upon him, yet they are real and good, so that's really important, especially when we get to the alternative or heretical positions. Number three, God creates in freedom and with purpose, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then finally, creation is fallen under a curse and needs supernatural healing. So this is the concept of redemption that comes about, and that will be important as we move later into chapters on redemption itself. So let's begin with the first one. God is the source of all that there is. This is a fundamental statement that drives all of Christian thought from the very beginning, even as we start with the Apostles' Creed back in the 2nd century. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and of earth. He is the creator and source of all that there is within creation. And that becomes largely important as we see that we are completely dependent upon Him, and as we move into a section on providence next, that will be even more important, that we maintain this perspective of God being the source of all that is. Second to that is this concept that creatures are dependent, yet they are real and good. And this is where some sort of heresies have crept into the church, but it's also where the church had to come down with a very specific doctrine called the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or creatio ex nihilo. This is an assertion that basically says that God created out of nothing. He didn't pour Himself into creation, because if He did that, then that means that because creation is fallen, there was something fallen in God. He didn't create out of Himself as an emanation, because if He did in some way create out of Himself, then part of creation is to be worshipped and honored, and we can't assert that either. We have to assume that in one way or another, God created ex nihilo, created out of nothing, that there was something that God was doing in and of Himself, where He created the world from nothing. And that completely removes God from the equation of the fallenness that has taken place. It doesn't solve the problem yet, but it certainly removes Him from that step, and it also removes Him from the step of us worshiping creation. So it was very important for early Christians that when we worship God and God alone. This is where the concept of idolatry creeps in, because there is nothing that is worthy of our worship in the world because of this central concept of creatio ex nihilo. So that's the third thing that comes up, and we see that all throughout church history. Through Olson says through Irenaeus, and Tertullian makes these statements. The Protestant reformers make similar statements as we go. Now, as we move into the third category that he mentions, God creates in freedom and with purpose. We see two things creeping back up, and this comes to us from our former chapter where we talked about God being both great and good. But in the concept of creating out of freedom, this exalts this concept of His greatness. If God is truly great, then creation cannot place limits on Him, as we'll see happens with some of the process theologians, but rather He creates freely out of His own goodwill and His own freedom. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there has to be some level of purpose, and of course this becomes very, very important when we move into our chapter on providence. If there's no purpose in His created order, then things are fatalistically determined, and we have problems with how bad things happen. We can't answer that question, and so we have to affirm that God is creating in freedom, and therefore He is truly great, but that He's also creating with some purpose, and it's not a malicious purpose, it's not a misaligned purpose. He's creating with a good purpose, and that takes us back to the concept of God being good. If God is good, then He created with purpose in mind. That's his third point. His final point is that creation is fallen under a curse and needs supernatural healing, or it needs redemption. Now, what's important about this idea of fallenness is that evil in and of itself is not something that is out there, but is rather the privation of something. It is the absence of good. And this was important not only to early theologians, but it took us into the Middle Ages. A particular philosopher, theologian by the name of Boethius in the Middle Ages really argued this point, that good, or that evil rather, is simply the privation of good. And when you come to an issue of creation being fallen, this is extraordinarily important so that we don't confuse fallenness or evil with a thing, with something that has crept in, but rather it is the privation or absence of good, in the same way that darkness is simply the privation or absence of light. We have to think of evil in those terms in order to make sense of what's taking place in a world where God is ultimately supreme, but there is also something evil that's taking place. If God is supreme, all-knowing, all-powerful, then a natural question that will arise is, well, then how in the world did this thing of evil come into existence and take over the world? God should be powerful enough to squash that. It should never have been a part of what was happening, especially if He's the creator of this environment. There shouldn't be a problem with a perfect creator. And the truth is, according to how theologians have explained this, that evil is, in essence, not a thing, but it is simply the absence of those things which are good and promising and gracious. And so that's where we have to make sure that we understand what's taking place when we say creation has fallen under a curse and needs supernatural healing, and ultimately needs to be embraced by the good. So I think of, when we address issues like this, I think of C.S. Lewis's comments on evil, that ultimately, when you think of hell and the privation of good, you don't think, you should not think of God as physically picking up humanity and tossing them into hell, but rather that humanity, through a series of our decisions, moves ourselves further and further away from God until the natural course of our actions is this hellish state. So as we move from God, we remove ourselves from the light. We get sucked into the absence of good, and in becoming surrounded by the absence of good, we surround ourselves with hell. And that's ultimately the way that Lewis will explain this, but it's not just C.S. Lewis who's explaining it this way. This goes way back into ancient and medieval theologians who will describe evil in the same way. Now, along with these four central concepts that must be held on to in order to have a solid Christian foundation of the doctrine of creation, there are some heresies or alternatives to the Christian consensus that Olson wants to remind us of. Those are simply this. There are three. The first one is dualism, the second is monism, and the third is naturalism. And naturalism to us, especially in a world that is surrounded by the creation versus evolution debate, seems to be the most popular one to think of. But let's hold that off in the same way that Olson does, because in sort of a folk way, we actually see how dualism and a little bit of monism could be maybe the more popular ones in our society. And let me explain. Dualism is simply the belief in two eternally existing opposing realities. Now, never in Christian history has there been a fundamental doctrine that has stated that we believe in two eternally existing opposing realities. And as Olson points out, our minds might immediately go to like Satan versus God. But we've never suggested as Christians that God and Satan are equals or that they are both eternal creatures. Rather, Satan is a created being of God. And that's the way that Christian theologians for years have spoken of the doctrine of Satan and of hell. And so we don't fit into this category. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that in our folk theology or the way that certain individuals practice faith, that it doesn't get communicated that way. And that's maybe where the problem begins to erupt. Because in each of our churches, we have probably seen individuals who sort of mistakenly bend this fine line quite often in the way that they speak of the devil. I've had the devil on my back all week. I've had Satan attacking me all week. Satan's got this power over my life. Satan is doing this. Satan is directing our government. Satan is da 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 da. It goes on and on and on. And what we do in creating that paradigm is that we actually do create a dualism. And we operate within that dualism, and that dualism ultimately affects our perspective on creation. Because if as we've heard in popular folk theology often, Satan is sort of the Lord of this world, as it would be proclaimed. If that is talked about, then that automatically creates a dualism and a negative perspective towards creation, when ultimately creation is God's order. Ultimately, the body is God's good creation, and Christian theology, we'll get to this when we explore the doctrine of the resurrection, Christian theology is not about the exaltation of the spirit to the neglect of the body, but it's rather the resurrection of the body and the spirit. And that's what caused Christianity to become so unique within the first century, is that there was a deep appreciation of both of these aspects of God and His created order. So that's the dualism. Now, the specific examples that that Olson will give is one, the Manichaeans, and that is a huge example. And it's also, the Manichaeans were hugely influential in the church. I know he states that Augustine stood against them, and in fact he did, but Augustine at one point in time was in fact a Manichaean. It's only later in his life that he rejects Manichaeanism and he turns towards Christianity. But Eastern Christians, Syriac Christians, Palestinian Christians even, were consistently influenced by the Manichaean dualism that crept in. So this is not such a cut and dry issue for the early church, and it did cause a lot of tension and heartache amongst various theologians as to how they would settle this issue. I would say the other very clear example in the modern church today is the church of Christian Science, and you've probably seen these small locations around certain metropolitan areas. You would see a Christian Science reading room, and it is a part of their theology. This dualism is a part of their theology that neglects deeply the flesh and exalts the spirit, and ultimately they will constantly be in that dualistic battle, and they will look at creation as an evil order and ultimately as an illusion to the higher spiritual reality that is out there and that we should all attain to. So that in many ways is sort of a modern example of this ancient reality of dualism represented by the Manichaeans. Moving on to the second, and this is maybe not so much seen in the church world as it is influence upon the church and in our current environment through New Ageism, is monism. And monism is the belief that all of reality is reduced to one substance. Usually it's, as Olson has said in his text, it's a spiritual substance that identifies God with all reality. So if we think of pantheism, this is particularly what pantheism is all about, which states that God is in all things. Again, pantheism, as described in earlier chapters, is not usually something that Christians will hold on to, but the more and more we move into the modern church world with an engagement, pluralistic engagement in New Age and those types of things, the more our regular practitioners of faith will be engaged with these concepts and will even at times synchronize them with Christian thought, which is where it's important as pastors and leaders we respond to this and be aware of what's happening. The one area that perhaps is a little bit more common in Christianity is this concept of emanationism, and it's not necessarily, again, mainstream. It is sort of these split branches, and it's an ancient reality that goes back to Gnosticism. But it is to suggest that rather than the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, which says God creates out of nothing, it suggests that creation is simply an overflow of God's divine substance in the world. And of course, the problems with this already abound. As I said earlier, it detracts from God's transcendence, suggesting that God has lowered himself in some way to the world, and it creates problems with idolatry in that we can and will worship created order because it is an emanation from God. So that's some of the major problems with the emanation idea, this monism idea that gets displayed in emanationism. He gives a long laundry list of groups that kind of bought into this trajectory throughout church history. But as I said, I think in the modern era, what we're often seeing is that New Ageism is creeping into Christian thought simply because of location in life. And so as individuals in our churches butt up against individuals who practice New Age or who kind of buy into this philosophy, maybe not practicing it, but buying into it, that will be a natural synchronistic process that takes place. And we have to be careful to recognize it within Christianity and recognize why monism is a problem, practically speaking, pastorally speaking, not just theoretically, as we go forward. Now, the third and final, which is the one that most of us are familiar with, is the concept of naturalism. And naturalism is actually is a modern reality. It's not an ancient reality because naturalism is an outcropping of a modern scientific revolution through empiricism. What should be understood by this is that within the concept of naturalism, there is in fact no room left for God. Naturalism as espoused by certain scientists, not all, this is not a bash against science, But it's the idea that modern science has left no room for believing in anything outside or beyond the material universe, and so that all we see is nature. So there's nothing beyond that. Now, this is a very new concept. Even in the ancient world, most pagan thinkers would have not considered that the material world is all that there is to the world. They would have been very readily apparent of realities beyond the material world. So that's why he says this is sort of a new battle, and it's one that has caused Christians, particularly conservative Christians, to battle against anything that is coming, anything that is aligning with that naturalistic philosophy. And the philosophy itself is problematic, that's true, but once you see that naturalism is a philosophy and it's not necessarily the science, then you can remove the two and you can still effectively use the science that is behind that, so that we don't simply go around assuming that Christians are unscientific and that there's only one way to lock into reality. Rather, what we have to do is see the way in which naturalism is a problem, because it is fundamentally atheistic, and it must be separated off as a philosophical structure from theological structures that would approach, would say that God is the creator of all things, that our world is in some way fallen, and that God created out of nothing, and ultimately. So that's the way that we can start to rebrand things. And I highlighted one line that I think is particularly important for us. It comes at the end of this section on Christian alternatives, or alternatives to the Christian tradition, rather. And Olson says this: the problem with evolution is that it is so often linked with naturalism in the minds of those who promote it, as well as in the minds and writings of those who reject it. So this concept, the central concept of evolution, which is ultimately a scientific concept, is both linked to naturalism by those who promote naturalism, and it's linked to naturalism by those in some Christian camps who reject naturalism. So it's all getting shoved over there, and there's very little room at times to say this is a scientific principle as opposed to the philosophical principle that is at work in naturalism, and we have to make sure that we understand that. Now, within that concept, let's talk about a few areas of diversity that is maybe appropriate and we're able to talk about. We've talked about the three alternatives, which are heretical principles that should not be adopted by any Christian within the great tradition. But now let's talk about where there's some room for diversity. And Olson describes three of those areas that are important to keep in mind. The first one he mentions is theistic evolution. The second is young earth creationism. And the third is progressive creationism. Now, in his dialogue, he's actually going to reverse the first two. So he'll talk about young earth creationism first and then theistic evolution, because that's the way it occurred in the timeline. But both of those, all three of these, as he would suggest, are alternatives to alternatives that continue to uphold the great Christian tradition centrally, all three of them. So none is better than the other in holding to the great tradition. It's just that each of them respond to it in different ways because of the way they respond to questions of when and how. And as he moves into this, one of the things that he describes is, and I think this is really important for us to keep in mind, is that young earth creationism ultimately begins not with the ancient church authors such as Augustine, Tertullian, Irenaeus. They speak very little about this, and in fact Augustine doesn't really hold to sort of a very typical young earth creationist perspective. St. Augustine of Hippo believes that the days of creation were more like epochs and not literal 24-hour days. But the official sort of development of a young earth creationism, which is about 6,000 or 7,000 years old, started in the 17th century with an Anglican bishop by the name of James Ussher. And Ussher sits down to create sort of a very literal timeline in Scripture using the dates and times that he sees, the birth dates that are there in Genesis, and all of the other time information that he can gather, and he counts back, and ultimately he ends up at about 4004 BC. Now there are some huge holes in his process. Some major issues that he overlooked, and his dating is a little bit askew and off. But that's basically where the concept of young earth creationism comes down to, and it actually arrives long before, or not long, but a good bit before Charles Darwin starts talking about evolution. And in that world, prior to Charles Darwin ever arriving, there is already pushback from some of the leading geologists in the world who are saying, yeah, I don't think that's quite right. There's some problems with that as we look at the natural world with that dating structure. It just doesn't line up. It doesn't make sense. There are things that look much, 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 much older than what we're doing. And of course, they aren't using radiocarbon dating or anything like that. They're simply looking at the strata and the different layers that are out there, and they're saying, yeah, there's something not quite right about this as the way we're observing the world. And so that's where problems arise between the scientific community and the Christian community. Even back then, this is a good bit before Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species ever came out, and there's already problems with this sort of perspective on young Earth creationism. Now, of course, it only becomes problematic, more and more problematic and more ingrained as Darwin comes out. But after the arrival of this concept of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin, there are certain Christian groups that are then responding and saying, okay, if that's the positive, if that's the scientific consensus and the reports that are coming to us, then we need to respond to that theologically, and that's where the traditional perspective on theistic evolution then arrived. Theistic evolution believes that the Bible narratives are certainly to be taken seriously, but that doesn't mean that they're to be taken literally. And so they will adapt, again, the central concept of God being creator, God creating ex nihilo, God looking at the world and seeing that it was fallen, God creating in freedom and with purpose. They accept all of those things, but they will simultaneously say that this is the method with which God has chosen to create the world, and it took place over millions of years, and it took place through a process that was kicked off called evolution. So it doesn't detract, theistic evolutions do not try to detract from this issue of purpose and freedom. They don't try to distract from this issue of fallenness, but they do try to explain things in correlation with scientific method. Now, somewhere in between there is the progressive creationists. And the progressive creationists don't believe in a young Earth, but they also don't believe in theistic evolution. They don't think either are really a viable option to follow. And what they would suggest is sort of this in-between state. And the reason that they try to suggest an in-between state that says that nature is completely permeated with God, but it's not, it is not God. You know, they try to maintain that balance. The reason they would do that is because they would suggest, or they would think that young Earth creationists ignore the fact that that most of church history has not really been young Earth. You know, even church fathers such as Augustine was not a young Earth creationist. They ignore that fact, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, they feel that theistic evolutionists just kind of buy into any scientific discovery that comes around. So the newest scientific discovery that's there, they just jump right on board with that. And sort of the progressive creationists don't think that that's a viable option to go either way. So they try to strike this middle ground as they go forward. And that's generally where each of these three camps settle. And if you'll remember, each of those, according to Olson, are falling within a great tradition, but they're just responding to questions of when and how in different ways. Now, if we can put aside for just a minute, as Olson finishes up, if we can put aside the questions of when and how, we might be able to move to a question, finally, that is a little bit more interesting to Olson, at least. It may not be interesting to us, but for him it is quite interesting. And that's the question of why. Why did God create? And for a couple of pages, Olson will finish out his chapter in that way, describing the way that Barth would think why God created, the way that Calvin and Zwingli thought that God created and why. That other modern theologians would describe him, amongst him Jürgen Moltmann and other Christian thinkers. Each of these, if we can step back from the question of when and how, will enable us to illuminate the question of why. And that's what Olson ultimately thinks we can do. And if we can come to some consensus, some central consensus that God has created an order that is good, though fallen, then we can start to do some very important things with the created order. We can start to shift our thinking. And his proposal at the end, which I think is quite engaging pastorally and practically, is that we start to see the way that we as Christians should be affirming some sort of engagement with upholding and protecting God's created order. If we believe it's truly good, though fallen, then we should be about preservation and restoration. In the same way that we believe in resurrected life, we, in alignment with Romans chapter 8, could see the resurrected life of God's entire created order. And I think that's a very important shift that Olson makes here at the end of his chapter, and one that should keep us thinking pastorally and practically how we will do that in all that we say and do. I look forward to reading your post this week. May God bless you as you go forward.